Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the RCG Speaker Series on Science and Social Relationships. I'm Brenda Voling, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this afternoon. Dr. Brett Peters received his PhD in social psychology from the University of Rochester in 2017, and he is currently Associate Professor of Psychology at Ohio University. Dr. Peters is known for taking an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of relationship processes and also utilizing multiple methods such as physiological measures, which focus on neuroendocrine and cardiovascular methods, behavioral coding of actual interactions, and self-reports of relationship functioning. His work has been guided by many theoretical perspectives, including biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat, the extended process model of emotional regulation, and adult attachment theory. Several of his studies have focused specifically on understanding stress and the dynamics of stress in romantic relationships, where he actually puts couples, he argues, need to be in stressful situations and paradigms to basically really be able to understand the unfolding of stress in these relationships. His research has been published in several high-impact journals, including Emotion, Psychophysiology, Affective Science, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, where his 2021 paper examining COVID-19 and intimate partner violence and its effects on individuals' health was one of the most cited papers in the period from 2021 to 2025. He was also a co-author on a large study, which I think also Amy Gordon, if she is still here, was also a co-author on, that was published in the Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences, where they looked at machine learning and the use of 43 longitudinal studies on relationship quality, looking at the most robust predictors of what constitutes a high-quality relationship. If you are interested, some of those predictors were the perceived commitment of your partner to the relationship, which would seem to make sense, sexual satisfaction, your partner's satisfaction with the relationship, low levels of conflict, greater life satisfaction, and lower depressive symptomatology. His current research and the focus of his talk today is examining co-rumination processes at the dyadic level. We had a very interesting discussion about how you could be measuring dyadic level processes when only one person in the dyad is answering or giving you responses. He will be presenting some of his recent ideas about the costs and benefits of co-rumination and what we need to do to move the science of co-rumination from a study that's been predominantly on adolescent friendships, mostly between white girls, to a more expansive framework that takes into consideration a more heterogeneous perspective on co-rumination in multiple social and relationship contexts and with multiple individuals. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brett Peters, who will be speaking to us today on It Takes Two to Co-Ruminate, an examination of co-rumination as a dyadic social emotion regulation strategy.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you for the introduction. That was really nice. When I was first invited to this series, I didn't know what the series was, and then I looked at it and I was like, oh, I should have, because you had a lot of famous speakers come through here. And so it is truly an honor to be invited to this series, and I'm really grateful that I'm here today and I get to share this work with you. So I'm going to be talking about some of the research that I've been doing over the past 8 years with my team about co-rumination specifically, and how we talk about stressful and upsetting topics with other people. This work brings together a combination of relationship science, affective science, and psychophysiology, and you'll see that in every single one of the studies that I show you today almost. And then in addition to that, we take, thank you for the intro, Brenda, a life as lived approach. So to study these interactions when we're talking to other people about stressful and upsetting topics, we're diving into what's going on as you're having that conversation or following you over daily life as you're dealing with stressful and upsetting topics throughout the weeks. I could not have done this work without the support of my former students. So you see pictured here, Aubriana and Ashley, who were my two first PhD students. And then who I consider to be my adopted student, Anna Di Giovanni. We met each other through the Love Consortium, if you're familiar with that, and have hit it off since then. And so they all, fortunately for them, got tenure track jobs this last cycle. So I'm just very proud to be presenting their work to you today. So relationship science for a long time has said that relationships are important. They're important for our mental health, they're important for our physical health, and they're important for just being connected to other people. And I think this is a group where I don't really have to talk too much about that or convince you of that. But even when we have connections with other people, oftentimes they can be negative. And even well-intentioned support providers can increase negative affect or internalizing symptoms within a given situation. The social support literature has been dealing with this paradox for decades. So on the one hand, when you're connecting with other people and talking about upsetting and stressful topics, you feel more connected to that person. That seems pretty straightforward. But you're also talking about upsetting topics. And so it can increase negative affect, increase internalizing symptoms like anxiety and depression. And so you have like this paradox of when you seek support, you still have some of these negative emotions sometimes, but then you're also feeling connected to the other person. And these can coexist. And so what is going on within these conversations that make these outcomes occur simultaneously? One of the arguments that I'm going to be making today is that one way we can kind of mechanistically understand why that's happening is through this concept of co-rumination. A lot of you are probably familiar with rumination. I have some people who are on some of the original papers about rumination, which is really cool to be in the room. But co-rumination is like this social rumination process. So when you're having some negative thoughts, you have some sort of stressor that you're trying to deal with, you often turn to other people. And when you turn to other people, you dig into the causes and consequences of the problem, you focus on the negative affect, you rehash the problem over and over again. This is the idea of co-rumination, where you have at least two people who are going back and forth and doing these things together. And within the co-rumination literature, which got its roots in the developmental literature, there's a pretty robust pattern of findings in that literature about some of the outcomes of co-rumination, and they follow the paradox that you see in the social support literature. So co-rumination is thought to be this fusion of self-disclosure and rumination. And so it's theorized that because of the self-disclosure component, that's why people are feeling more connected to each other. But then because of this ruminative component, this is why social support interactions can be associated with more negative affect, but then also more internalizing symptoms like anxiety and depression. And this is what co-rumination scholars refer to as the trade-off hypothesis of co-rumination. On the one hand, you get these interpersonal benefits, but then on the other hand, you get the intrapersonal costs associated with this social emotion regulation strategy. So let's make this come to life a little bit more with a cherry-picked example that represents the literature of co-rumination when I first started. And so we have this 15-year-old girl, Jenny, who's considering breaking up with her boyfriend. Stressful and upsetting topic. And so she's thinking about potentially breaking up with her boyfriend. She's thinking about all the things that are going wrong in the relationship. And when she's dealing with all of these things, she turns to her friend who's like, yeah, that sounds pretty bad. Why don't we dig into that and figure out what's going on? Why do you think you want to break up with your boyfriend? What's everything that's going wrong in the relationship? Focusing on the negative affect, focusing on how Jenny's feeling in the moment. And when they talk about this issue, they go back and forth speculating about the causes and the consequences of why Jenny thinks she wants to break up with her boyfriend and really dig into things. This is the idea of co-rumination. And so based on the co-rumination literature, we would expect that relative to friends who co-ruminate less, that Jenny and her friend are going to be closer, but then also that Jenny's going to experience more internalizing symptoms, so more negative affect, more depression, and more anxiety. So here is a roadmap for today's talk, and it's kind of broken up into 4 parts. The first 3 parts is going to be focusing on, okay, we have these negative affect and closeness effects that are associated with co-rumination. Can we branch out and look at more outcomes? I was trained as a psychophysiologist, and so naturally my first thought was, let's try some physiology. And so we'll be able to see that. I'll explain that theory and go through that. For the second part of the talk, we dug into the operationalization of co-rumination itself as a dyadic process and dug into, well, what if we operationalize co-rumination in a dyadic dynamic way? Does this affect the traditional trade-off hypothesis and the outcomes of co-rumination? The third part of the talk is we're going to be digging into the problems that people are actually talking about. It's a little shocking how much we just kind of ignore that. I'm guilty of it too in all the co-rumination research, but we just kind of set that part aside and focus on the outcomes of co-rumination without considering what people are even talking about. And that seems like a huge problem. And so we just started getting into that work both on a theoretical level, and then also we've started to collect some cool data that I'm going to be able to share with you on that too. And then for the last part, we'll kind of wrap it up and say how co-rumination can be applied to everything, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So I was trained as a psychophysiologist and thinking about how the mind and the body are connected and using physiology as a tool to try to tap into psychological states. So I'll explain that a little bit when I get there, but basically that was the first question of, okay, is co-rumination associated with how people's bodies are responding in the moment when they're engaging in the strategy? Work up to this point, well, first of all, just social emotion regulation attempts, social support interactions implicate physiology in general. In every single conversation that I've looked at, we get the fight or flight system online, pretty much a guaranteed. I've never seen it not happen. And so when you're having conversations with other people, physiology is implicated, we see variability, and so it seems like a pretty good context to look at it. Within the co-rumination literature, at the time that we did the study, so this is one of the first studies that I did at Ohio University, at the time in the literature, co-rumination was associated with more cortisol. Cool. But most of this work was not dyadic, so they treated the dyad as a single unit, or a lot of co-rumination work also just looks at co-rumination from the perspective of the person with the problem, or who I'll be referring to as the discloser throughout the talk, and not considering both people in the interaction simultaneously and independently. The work that I was mentioning in terms of cortisol was more observational, so I come from an experimental background as well, and as you'll see, we're just going to tell people to co-ruminate as part of the manipulation to see if we can get some movement in the physiology. And then of this work, so cortisol is cool and it's actually more associated with health outcomes than some of the stuff I'm going to show you. But what's cool about the physio that I'm going to show you is that it's supposed to be linked to your psychological state. So we can infer what's going on in your head as you're having these conversations with people without having to ask you, which is kind of fun. And then as Anna would tell you, everything is a heterogeneous process. And so when we look at physio, we have repeated measures and we can look at the heterogeneity of what's going on within these interactions as well. It shouldn't be the case that everybody's outcomes of co-rumination look similar. And so you'll see that as well. So first, the biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat. This is the theory that we use to try to understand the physiological responses that we take in the lab in the moment. It's these cardiovascular responses. And what this theory is saying is when you're in a motivated performance situation that you care about, it's goal relevant, it's a situation where you care about what other people think about you, that your appraisals of stress in that interaction impacts your psychological state, and that psychological state has a downstream effect on your physiology. So within the context of this theory, when we say appraisals, it's talking about not necessarily a conscious process, but resources and demands going into a situation. And if you feel like you have the resources to cope with the demands of the situation, then that's supposed to lead to more of a psychological state of challenge and less threat. And then physiologically, your body responds in kind. You feel like you can deal with the situation, and so your body pumps out more blood and it dilates your peripheral vasculature so that the oxygenated blood can get to where it needs to go, to your brain and to the periphery. You feel like you can deal with the situation, your body's saying, great, I'm going to send you the resources that you need to deal with the stressor. If your demands outweigh your resources to cope, then you're more on the threat end of the continuum. You feel like you can't deal with the situation in front of you, and your body also responds in kind. It prepares for physical damage and defeat. It prepares for something to happen to you where like you might lose a little blood. And so your vasculature actually constricts, It limits blood flow to the periphery. And so it again is preparing for physical damage and defeat. So you feel like you can't deal with it, your body's responding in kind too. For those of you that are more familiar with the theory, I'm streamlining it a little bit and only talking about some of the specifics here and only talking about total peripheral resistance. I'm happy to go into more detail if you're interested or have more questions about it. So using that theory where we can use physiology to get at what's going on in the moment as it's happening without having to ask people was the draw for this initial study. And we wanted to experimentally manipulate co-rumination, as I mentioned. And so within the co-rumination literature at the time, there wasn't really a good experimental manipulation of co-rumination. And then we were trying to think, okay, in terms of a challenge and threat framework and thinking about resources and demands, what do we think is going to happen physiologically? We had to draw mostly on the rumination literature, which you're going to see as a repeating pattern as we talk about what our predictions were going into some of these studies. But based on the rumination literature, people who ruminate more tend to perceive the problem as more upsetting and harder to solve. They have poor problem-solving skills. To me, that as a challenge threat researcher, that all sounds like more demands and less resources. So we felt pretty confident going into the study that the people who are identifying a problem that they're having to talk about and having to deal with it and co-ruminating, that those people are going to experience more physiological threat than those who are not. Felt like a pretty safe bet. We were less sure about responders, and I remember sitting with Ashley in like her first year of graduate school, and we were having our weekly meetings going back and forth about like, what do we think the responders are going to do? On the one hand, you can think, okay, this is my best friend or my romantic partner. We're interdependent. Great, my problem is your problem. And so if you have a problem, I'm going to experience all the same costs that you're going to because we're so close. On the other hand, it's ultimately not your problem. And so you can have that conversation, but you don't have to deal with the fact that you're not really solving the problem necessarily. You're just kind of digging into the causes and the consequences of the problem. You're focusing on the negative affect, and then you can step away if you want. So we had competing hypotheses, and we were like kind of not really sure how that would go. And so in the framework of the study that I'm going to present to you, I'll show the methodology on the next slide. But basically, we were like, okay, we're either going to see a main effect of condition, right? We're going to have this co-rumination manipulation and then some other control condition that I'll talk more about. Or we're going to see a condition by role interaction. The idea that, okay, maybe the physiological outcomes of co-rumination are specific to the person disclosing their problem. And so we're only going to see the physiological costs of co-rumination for people who are disclosing their problems relative to any other group. Aim 2 of the study, co-rumination, is supposed to be this cyclical getting back and forth, digging into things, tuning into the other person, and digging into this negative affect stuff. Seems like physiological synchrony could also be involved as well. And so we have some work looking at fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system responding in the moment, and whether that's happening and is different based on whether you were in the co-rumination condition or the control condition. So just to review the first hypothesis in particular. So on the x-axis, you can see the experimental manipulations that I'll be talking about, the co-rumination or the natural condition. The two different lines that are up there are whether the role in the conversation, so whether you were the discloser or the responder. And then I have those little pictures to show you the extent to which the vasculature is constricting or dilating to kind of remind you visually about, okay, if it's constricting more, that's limiting blood flow, you feel like you can't deal with the situation. So higher scores on the y-axis mean more physiological signs of psychological threat. And so what's pictured here is disclosers in the co-rumination condition we hypothesize are going to exhibit physiological signs of threat relative to those that were in a natural condition, and then hedged on the responders and kind of put them midway in between because we weren't sure. So as I mentioned, we experimentally manipulated co-rumination in the lab, and we're just so smart. How did we do that? We just told them to do it. So on the left side, you see the co-rumination condition, and we picked out some of the key dimensions of co-rumination. and just said, hey, do this in your upcoming conversation. Stay on topic, go over the problem again, figure out the causes and the consequences, and dig into the negative affect. We also debated for quite a while on the control condition, and we ultimately ended on just talk about the problem as you naturally would, okay, as a comparison group. We did this with 172 friend dyads and then 139 romantic dyads. And in addition to the condition assignment, we also then had the role part of it too. So there's the discloser, who's the person who has the problem that they identified, that they are going to then talk about for 8 minutes and disclose to their close friend or their romantic partner. And then the responder is the person who's responding. Yeah. Yeah, they did each take a turn. The physiology basically goes away in the second conversation. So it's all going to be focused on the first conversation. Yeah. So here are the results. So the graph is going to be set up in the same way that it was on the other slide. So on the x-axis, you have the co-rumination condition or the natural condition. The y-axis, physiological signs of threat. Higher scores on that is going to be greater signs of psychological threat. And then the two different colored bars that are going to come up are whether you were the discloser or the responder in the first conversation in particular. And so we found the condition by role interaction. So that disclosers who were in the co-rumination condition were exhibiting the most signs of psychological threat than any other group in the study. And that actually benefited us because one, we had a lot of debates about what the control condition should be. And so it was actually really nice that responders basically looked the same as the control condition, which saved us from some reviewer comments, which was fun. Okay, so now for the second part. Are people physiologically syncing up while they're co-ruminating? I can get into a whole tangent about why we can't look at the challenge threat responses. Specifically because of the way that we look at challenge and threat responses in the moment, but we can look at people's fight or flight response, sympathetic nervous system responding, and look at the synchrony in that system. Okay, so it'll be slightly different physiological measures that I'm looking at, but the question is about the extent to which, when we're talking about stressful and upsetting topics with each other, is our physiology moving in the same direction or not? And so within the co-rumination literature, this was a more recent study because Anna came along later after we had already collected the data and was like, hey, we should do physiosynchrony here. I was like, great, go for it. And so we were able to look at the literature and what had happened. And so we see signs of negative synchrony. So that means that in the parasympathetic nervous system or the rest and digest system, that when one person's moving up or having more parasympathetic activity, the other person's actually going in the other direction. So that's negative synchrony. And then in terms of adrenal cortical attunement, so like cortisol, that was moving in the same direction. So when one person's co-ruminating more, when one person's co-ruminating more than the other person and their cortisol responses, they're going up at the same time, which is great, or down at the same time. Similar to the cardiovascular responses and the reasons why we were using it and the explanation for all of that on the past couple of slides, same applies here. We can look at fight or flight responses in the moment as it's happening and look at it over the course of the conversation and look at the extent to which people are moving together. And so what did we find? That indeed, as disclosers were exhibiting more of a fight or flight response in the interaction, responders were too. So just in general, in social support interactions, we're seeing synchrony or linkage in terms of physiology in the social support context between disclosures and responders. But that's not quite the question I was asking. We were looking at condition differences, and we didn't find any. So that's not to say that physiological linkage or synchrony wasn't happening in that condition. It's just that the relative difference between those two groups was not significantly different. And indeed, what Anna would tell you is that this process is heterogeneous. So we can actually look at the slopes of synchrony for every single dyad in the data set. On the top part of the slide, you're seeing the data set for friends, and on the bottom part, you're seeing it for romantic partners. And that like reddish purple dashed line that's going through is 0. And then anything to the left of that would be negative synchrony. So as one person's going up, the other person's going down. And then anything to the right of that is positive. For for friends, the range of the slopes was going from negative 0.05 to 0.46, and about 5% was showing evidence of negative synchrony. And then romantic partners had a wider range. So we saw about 30% of the sample was in the negative synchrony part, which is kind of interesting. And we don't really know why. And we have some speculative reasons, but we don't mechanistically know what's going on yet. But we're starting to see a pretty consistent pattern that what's going on in romantic relationships versus friends is quite different. And we're seeing just less outcomes in general on the romantic relationship side. I can talk more about that later. So what are some of the conclusions based on this first part of the talk? One is that the effects of co-rumination are role dependent. So you need to consider both people in the interaction. And so when we constrain the situation so that it's a person disclosing their problem to somebody else and there's distinct roles in what's going on, that affects the outcomes of co-rumination. And so we saw that on a physiological level. And then Audrey, who's in the audience today, one of my grad students, is diving into the traditional trade-off hypothesis outcomes of co-rumination and going back and looking at negative affect and closeness. And we're finding when we take like a within subjects approach to this whole thing and considering the different roles, that the negative affect effect, people who are disclosing their problems and co-ruminating more, those are the people that are experiencing more negative affect relative to responders. So there's a role difference even in the traditional trade-off hypothesis part too. What's also cool is we also looked at heterogeneity here, and it's fun when everything goes in the same direction. So there was no exceptions to this pattern. Every single time the disclosures were when people adopted a disclosure role, they experienced more negative affect than when they adopted a responder role. It was a within-person kind of study where you went into each specific role across the study. In addition, the physiological synchrony findings are showing that just in general in social support interactions, your fight or flight system is on average positively associated. So as one person's is going up, so is the other person's. And then who you're seeking support from matters, at least descriptively, across friends and relationship partners. We're seeing a much wider range when you're talking to your romantic partner about stressful and upsetting topics and co-ruminating within those conversations. Okay, that's cool. We experimentally yeah, sure. Go for it. Yep. Good question. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So in that study, they were supposed to identify a problem that did not involve the other person. So you were specifically supposed to be identifying problems that wasn't about the relationship specifically, and that was true across the friend data set and the romantic partner data set. We basically ran those studies simultaneously. Yep. Yep. Okay. So we experimentally manipulated co-rumination by telling people to do it. That's fun, but that's not how actually co-rumination happens. And it's kind of surprising, which Brenda mentioned in her intro, which is great, thank you, that it's in the name, co-rumination, that we need to look at both people. And we're making the argument that we should operationalize co-rumination in that way too. And so we were thinking about the definition of co-rumination, thinking about how people typically define it. And I think one of the most common ways is the trait measure of co-rumination. You can ask people a list of 27 questions. They're thinking about their close friend or their romantic partner, whoever they turn to most when they're trying to deal with their stressful and upsetting topics. And on average, across conversations that I have with this person, to what extent do we co-ruminate? Cool. Then we've adapted that questionnaire in a more state-like way, and we can pull on the different dimensions of co-rumination and ask people in the moment in response to a conversation, what's going on? But a lot of these items just kind of muddled the whole process. It's like asking about, well, we do this, and it's not clear the extent to which each person is contributing to the co-rumination process. So what happens if we look at co-rumination and operationalize it in a dyadic and dynamic way? Does this then affect the trade-off hypothesis of co-rumination? And so we're thinking about this theoretically, and as we were thinking about it theoretically, we had someone who did state space grid stuff come along, and I was like, oh, that's kind of it. That's what we want to look at. So I'll walk you through the theoretical framework that we're thinking about, and then I'll explain what state space grids are if you haven't heard of that before. So on the x-axis here is one person's social rumination attempts. I'm changing the language a little bit to say social rumination. It's making it distinct from rumination, where it's clear that it's happening in some sort of social context, but it's just one person's contribution to the process. And then on the y-axis is going to be the other person's contributions to the social rumination attempt. Okay. This creates a plane with different regions. And so in this region where both people are reporting that they're relatively low in social rumination, great, they're just talking about some sort of stressor that's ongoing in their life, but it's not necessarily a ruminative process. Cool. There's then these situations where one person is engaging in relatively high levels of social rumination, and the other person is engaging in relatively low levels of social rumination. That's not to say that they're not responding. That's not to say that they're not doing anything, but they're not socially ruminating in response. And then what we consider to potentially be true co-rumination is when both people are reporting that they're engaging in this socially ruminative behavior. That's what we're conceptualizing and operationalizing as co-rumination. And so if we theoretically define co-rumination in this way and we try to operationalize it to capture it, do we still see the trade-off hypothesis of this interpersonal costs and interpersonal benefits? And to what extent do people even exist in the space? So in this study, it's a pared down version of what I talked about earlier. So we just looked at close or best friends. We didn't have that experimental manipulation of co-rumination. It was basically just the natural condition, right? So we still had a discloser and a responder. Both people filled out a packet where they identified personal problems, but then we randomly assigned one person to be the discloser, disclose that problem, talk about it for 8 minutes. Great. After the conversation, we got at the typical trade-off hypothesis outcomes that you would expect from the literature. So negative affect, we're relationship scientists, so we look at responsiveness, how solved the problem was, and then from the discloser's perspective, how supportive they thought the responder was. What's cool about the study and why we had to run a separate study and not just look at the other data that I just showed you was that they then did like an adapted version of this empathic accuracy paradigm where we video recorded the conversation and then the participants basically become their own coders. So they watch the video and every 30 seconds they're pausing the video and the disclosers are rating their contributions of social rumination. And then the responders are rating their contributions to social rumination every 30 seconds across the 8-minute conversation. And so this is that theoretical framework again. And I was at the Society for Affective Science at a conference, ran into a state space gridder, they like to call themselves, and invited them to come to Ohio University and talk about it more. And as they were talking about it, I was like, oh, it's that, which is kind of fun. So we can change that theoretical model into the state space grid framework. Within the state space grid framework, you can a priori define regions of interest called an attractor region. And so for us, obviously, one of the key regions we're interested in is what we would consider to be co-rumination, that upper right quadrant. And then we wanted to pick something else as a comparison group. And given that most of the literature either collapses across the dyad and just looks at the average, or oftentimes looks at it from the disclosure perspective, we picked the disclosure region in the bottom right as the other comparison region of interest. And so what's really cool is that it's like a visual tool too. So for every single dyad in the data set, you can track how they're moving throughout the conversation. And so I cherry picked a prototypical example that you would think of where, okay, we have a discloser who has a personal problem, potentially hasn't disclosed it to their friend before. So they need to spend some time talking about it and detailing it to the other person. Great. So they spend the first couple of minutes where, in this case, the discloser is socially ruminating about this problem to their close friend, but their close friend isn't really engaging in social rumination behavior in response. Great. But then as the conversation progresses, they spend time in the co-rumination region, and they actually spend a few minutes there where both people are saying that they're contributing to the socially ruminative process. And then eventually towards the end of the conversation, they move out of that region. Maybe they're talking about something else now, or they're just not ruminating about it as much and end the conversation here. So I mentioned that state space gridders call these like a priori defined regions attractor regions. What is that? The best way I can describe it is it's like the extent to which the dyad is getting sucked into a particular region. How do we quantify that? How much time are you spending in the region? That's pretty straightforward. But then there's also one called transitional propensity. So this is where if you, in this case, if we're focusing on the co-rumination region in particular, if you have an opportunity to move into the co-rumination region, do you, as a dyad? And in this case, the answer is yes, because I cherry-picked the example. But now in this example, I'm in the co-rumination region, or the dyad is in the co-rumination region. We also now have an opportunity to move back into the disclosure unidirectional social rumination region. Do we? We don't. We stay in the co-rumination region. So this idea of attractors is basically you get a variable in your data set that's an attractor strength for a predefined region. So we have a variable in the data set that's like co-rumination attractor strength. And then we also have disclosure unidirectional social rumination strength. So 2 questions. 1, do dyads even exist in the space? 2, if they do, can we quantify it where we can look at the extent to which dyads are getting like sucked into a particular region, quantify it, and then use that variable to predict outcomes like the traditional trade-off hypothesis stuff? So do they exist in the space? The answer is yes. So on average, dyads spent about 2 minutes in the co-rumination region. And they spent about 1 minute in the unidirectional disclosure social rumination region. But there's meaningful variability in this process. So on the x-axis, you can see the proportional duration of time spent in the conversation. And then on the y-axis is every single dyad in the data set. And so in red is the co-rumination region. In the light blue is the unidirectional social rumination region. And then in the darker blue is every other area that we didn't define a priori. And then we can actually look at dyads in the data set and pull them out with this method and look at where they were. So this is an example of a dyad who got sucked into the co-rumination region. They weren't really coming out of it. And when they did come out of it, they went back in. Okay. There's then this region where they were kind of like aligned on the diagonal, but they weren't really spending time in either of the regions that we defined. And then there's this one here where they're spending a lot of time in the disclosure unidirectional social rumination region. So what happens with the trade-off hypothesis? We can put both of those predictors into our models at the same time. So we can have the extent to which dyads get sucked more into the co-rumination region, controlling for the amount of time that they spent in the disclosure unidirectional social rumination region. And we see evidence that co-rumination, when it's defined in this dyadic dynamic way, we kind of just see benefits across the board. So both people in the interaction are rating the problem as more solved. Both people are rating their partners as more responsive. And the disclosures are rating the responders as being more supportive in the interaction. So you're getting some of the interpersonal benefits, the problem is actually being more solved, which is something that is kind of theoretically assumed, but often not looked at in the literature. And usually the assumption is that the problem is not being solved. But here we're finding when we define it in this dyadic dynamic way and we get people sucked into the region that they're actually solving the problem too, which is pretty cool. And importantly, what's not here is that there was no differences in negative affect. So the more that you got sucked into the co-rumination region as a dyad, didn't necessarily, or wasn't necessarily associated with more negative affect. What about the disclosure unidirectional social rumination region? So the more that the dyad got sucked into that situation where the disclosure is socially ruminating at the other person and the other person isn't necessarily socially ruminating back, what happens? Evidence is more mixed. So here the disclosures are still saying that they rate the problem as more solved, but for responders there was no association. And it was trending or not significant, depending on your point of view, that from the discloser's perspective that their partner was trending in the direction of being more responsive, but that it was going in the other direction for responders, and they were rating their partner as less responsive in those interactions. So from this work, one, we're showing that just in general, dyads exist in these spaces, theoretically, that we kind of mapped out on that plane. About 2 minutes in the co-rumination region and of an 8-minute conversation, so like about a fourth of the conversation, and then about a minute in that unidirectional disclosure social rumination region. When dyads were getting sucked into the co-rumination region more, we just saw benefits and not necessarily affective costs. So they were rating the problem as more solved, they felt closer to, they viewed the other person as more responsive, and disclosures felt that the responders were being more supportive in the interaction. And then we saw more asymmetric outcomes when we looked at the strength of the unidirectional disclosure social rumination region, when one person was just socially ruminating at the other person. So again, this work was trying to operationalize co-rumination in a dyadic, dynamic way. And when we do that, we're seeing consequences for the trade-off hypothesis that dominates the literature in co-rumination. Okay, now I mentioned this a little bit before, but we basically ignore what people are talking about. We're guilty of this as a lab, so is most of the field. There is some work that is looking at problems in particular, and people have done a little bit of work on it, but there's much to be done in this area. And that seems pretty important. It seems pretty important, not just in terms of like the traditional trade-off hypothesis of co-rumination, but like also different contexts, you have different goals. You go into those conversations with different ideas about the conversation and how it should go, what you're talking about. It should expand the outcomes of co-rumination beyond negative affect and closeness. You can think about situations that are more societal or systemic, and this should be impacting broader behaviors beyond the typical trade-off hypothesis. And so this should have a pretty intense impact on the process of co-rumination itself. And we feel like if we want to study co-rumination and get at the mechanism for why things are happening, part of what we need to start doing is looking at what people are talking about and how that impacts the outcomes. So theoretically, to do this, we're using Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory to kind of map out the potential problems that people could be talking about. And for most of the co-rumination literature, it's dominated within like the microsystem level, and occasionally we'll go a little bit past that. But most of the time, and again, our lab is guilty of this too, where we're taking convenient samples, and really what we're doing is we're looking at people who are stressed about their tests that they have coming up, or they're stressed about some sort of relationship thing that's going on in their life. But we think that talking to other people about problems expands beyond that and well beyond that. And when we start looking at when people are talking about climate change or systemic racism or politics, what's going on within those conversations, and when people are turning to other people about stressful and upsetting topics that branch out beyond the individual, how does that impact the co-rumination process and the outcomes of co-rumination? And so we just started doing some of this work. Well, one, we have a bunch of data sets where people identified their problems. We have all the data. We can start digging back into that. If you're interested in co-rumination and you want to start digging with us and getting in here, great. Then let me know and email me. We're interested. But then also we took advantage of the presidential election and did daily diaries before and after the election. And it's kind of fun. I haven't gotten into political research too much, but it just felt like a natural overlap of co-rumination, talking about stressful and upsetting topics surrounding the election and seeing what's happening. So there's a recent survey to suggest that about 77% of the country is stressed about the future of the country. And when we're stressed about things, we turn to other people. And when we turn to other people, they can be stressful and upsetting topics, which is where co-rumination is. And so the argument that we're making is that even when you're talking about stressful and upsetting topics, and it's really negative, that is actually going to be associated with political action. From the rumination literature, there's two competing theories. So there's like a response styles trait-like perspective on co-rumination, saying like, okay, in general, when I ruminate more, I tend to behaviorally avoid situations. And so in that sense, your hypothesis would be, okay, more co-rumination then is going to be associated with less political action. Then there's like a more motivational account of rumination that's saying, well, one of the reasons we ruminate is it's a problem that's not solved. And so when we ruminate, then it motivates us to stay engaged with the behavior and stay engaged with the goal. And so to the extent that we're looking at rumination and co-rumination from more of a state-like perspective, which is what we're going to do in the daily diary, then we can expect that, okay, maybe co-rumination is actually going to be associated with more political action via this motivation to stay engaged with politics. So there was two studies. I am not as in the weeds in these studies. I did not do the primary data collection here. So this is led by Anna and some of her team. So if you have questions about the data set, I might say I don't know. But for study one, we had 4 waves, 6 weeks prior to the election, 2 weeks prior to the election, 2 weeks post-election, 6 weeks post-election. What's cool about that study is it's more politically diverse. So there's a relatively even split between conservatives and liberals, which is great. In study 2, the design of the study was kind of cooler. So we had every single day, 2 weeks before the election and 2 weeks after. And so we can start looking at more of the variability and within-person processes in that data set than the study 1. The problem was that it was less politically diverse. Fortunately for us, the findings generally replicated across the 2 studies. And so I'm just going to focus on visualizing and showing you some of the results from study 2 in particular. So in general, what happened on average in terms of co-rumination and political action the 2 weeks before and then the 2 weeks after the election? You can just visually see that on election day, both of those and the day after, both of those variables spiked generally across the board for people. But that's just holistically looking at averages across the entire sample. But if we want to like dig in and say, when I co-ruminate more than I typically do, am I engaging in more political action? And so we can start looking at the extent to which political action and co-rumination are moving together or not. And so in the left panel, you can see when co-rumination and political action are moving together, but it's not spiking necessarily on election day. Then there's the panel in the middle where there is a spike on election day in particular. And then there's the third panel where they're kind of moving independent of one another. Okay, so again, we're seeing variability in the process, which isn't terribly surprising. And the within-person effect was there. So on days when I co-ruminated more than I typically did across the diary period, I also reported engaging in more political action on that day. And again, it's on a single day. It's a mediation model, all the traditional caveats of that, blah, 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 blah. But on days when I report co-ruminating more than I typically did across the diary, I also report staying more motivated to stay engaged in politics. And that greater motivation to stay engaged with politics is associated with more political action and explains about 40% of the variance in the total effect. Yeah. A whole range of behaviors. It was like a list of 20 items that ranged anywhere from engaging with some sort of like political media type stuff to going to a protest to, it was the whole gamut. Yeah. And you did miss that because I didn't present it. So good question. Okay. So if we take a look at the 3 different parts of the talk so far together and come up with some conclusions, one is that the impact of co-rumination weaves a more complex story than the traditional trade-off hypothesis. And we are seeing that from a physiological perspective. And then also I plugged some of Audrey's work that's looking at the traditional trade-off hypothesis and how that's also role dependent. If you specify the situation in a way where you have someone disclosing a problem and you distinguish between those roles and look at them, that has consequences for the typical trade-off hypothesis. Co-rumination isn't the stable, synchronized interaction that's theoretically assumed. You would think that if people are digging into the causes and the consequences, rehashing the problem over and over again, it kind of sounds like their physiology should be linked. And in terms of a fight or flight response and synchronization, we're not really seeing that. And then from the state space grid work, operationalizing co-rumination in a dyadic and dynamic way had consequences for the trade-off hypothesis. The more that people got sucked into what we define as co-rumination, the more we just saw benefits across the board without the affective costs necessarily. And then we're just starting the work looking at what people are talking about. And when we look at something like politics and thinking about co-rumination and what's relevant when you're trying to talk to other people about stressful and upsetting topics in that context, that then has implications where we can expand beyond the traditional trade-off hypothesis and look at outcomes that go beyond negative affect and closeness. This is how we currently feel about co-rumination after all of this work. We feel like we're just at the tip of the iceberg and there's all this information underneath. The fact that we haven't really looked at what people are talking about is wild to us, and it seems like wild to everybody else in the field, and so we're interested in looking at that. But based on this framework and what we have learned, I feel like there's a lot of crosstalk between what co-rumination can provide in terms of affective science and relationship science and social psych more broadly, but then also what those theories can also contribute to co-rumination. And so we saw within this work that when we treat co-rumination as like this dyadic affective phenomenon and bring to bear those theories on the concept of co-rumination, we define it in a dyadic dynamic way that's having an impact on the traditional outcomes of co-rumination, which is really cool. I tend to hyperfixate on a particular study or a particular emotion regulation strategy. So even in work in grad school, I focused on suppression. Work as a professor, I've been focusing on co-rumination. And I know that this is not how people regulate their emotions in everyday conversations and just focus on one emotion regulation strategy at a time. And so I want to have conversations with people, if you're interested in it, about thinking about polyregulation, the idea that people are dynamically changing how they're regulating their emotions over time, how there's different patterns to that probably, like as one person or as the dyad is co-ruminating, then where do they transition out and where do they go in terms of regulating their emotions? That seems kind of cool. And then the flexibility argument in general, that people aren't just co-ruminating all the time. There were some dyads in the study that were co-ruminating all the time. But they're flexibly engaging in the strategy. Sometimes they're leaving it for a little bit and then coming back to it. And so harnessing that flexibility and looking at how that matters. Can you co-ruminate about something and then stop? And does that actually have more benefits than just sitting there and co-ruminating the entire time? There's connections with relationship science as well. So we have the intimacy process model. I kind of plugged that a little bit, where we're looking at the extent to which co-rumination is associated with perceiving your partner as responsive, or just outside of the observers rating the process of co-rumination as generally just being responsive behavior within the interaction. But then also this idea of shared reality. So the two of you coming together when you co-ruminate, the idea is you're digging into the causes and the consequences, you're focusing on the negative affect. From an intimacy process model, that's kind of validating, but you're also converging on your thoughts. You're both agreeing that it's like focused on the negative affect. You're talking about the causes and the consequences, and so that should put you more in sync. But then just broadly with co-rumination, we don't really view it as a maladaptive strategy. Your goal going into a social situation is not always to decrease negative affect. And so we don't necessarily think co-rumination is a bad strategy to be engaging in. And what we need to be doing is looking at the specific context that people find themselves in, the goals that they have going into that interaction, what they want to get out of the interaction when they seek out a particular person to co-ruminate with them, and how that impacts the potential outcomes of co-rumination. And that really, this should be at the forefront of thought. Thank you.
Questions? I'm going to grab the microphone here, so anybody who's interested in asking Dr. Peters questions, that is great. I'm ready to go.
Thank you, Brett. That was awesome and amazing methods and studies. So thinking about closeness as a requirement for the process, and if you examined length of relationship and if that matters at all, and then at what point in a new relationship do you think we would see kind of the outcomes like you did? I'm imagining, on a first date, you might not want to do this, but there is some kind of affiliative opportunity to, vent about something. So yeah, any thoughts about sort of that?
Yeah, so a lot of our samples so far can't really get at that question very well, but it's not really an answer to that question specifically, but one of the things that we're thinking about with the differences that we're seeing between couples and friends is part of that dynamic, that like friends are wanting to engage in this like negativity validation pattern more, where they like really get into it, dig into it, talk about the problems. Whereas for romantic partners, maybe you're trying to solve the problem. It's something that you know that's more chronic, and you know how to provide support in that specific context for that person. And so you're actually like engaging in like, I mean, this is an optimistic take, but like more effective emotion regulation to like provide practical support in that specific circumstance, because you know what your partner is dealing with and how they're going to go about the problem. But yeah, basically in all of our studies, there's not enough variability in the length of the relationship to really get at any of those questions, but it does seem kind of interesting, and it feels like if we link it to the intimacy process model, like it's all about self-disclosure. Like what we're talking about at the end of the day is people with their problems. And when you self-disclose, it creates an opportunity to be responsive. And so it's like part of the relationship initiation, formation, like intimacy process. And then what happens as that kind of becomes a little bit more stable, maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much. This was really exciting work. I mean, we talked a bit before. I'm always really intrigued by and excited by like dyadic dynamic processes, and it's really cool that you saw that you didn't find this typical trade-off when you measured it in that way.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I guess, just to learn more about how you're thinking about why, like how measuring it in this dyadic dynamic way, how you saw different results in that regard. Like the prior way that people typically looked at co-rumination, was that getting at theoretically a different area of the state space grid, like maybe a corner rather than the top right corner than what
Yep.
how you conceptualized it now in this dyadic dynamic way? Or yeah, basically just like why do you think that you got these different results?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right. So I think most research up to this point was basically looking at like the diagonal, because they were averaging across both people in the dyad. And so it wasn't actually clear if people are really high, is that kind of like coming from a midpoint for one person and then really high for another person, which would then still put you in this category. So I feel like most research that collapsed across the dyad was looking at this and then not distinguishing between like each person's individual contribution to it. And I feel like part of what's going on is, again, because I'm a relationship researcher, I'm thinking about like if you're really digging into the negative consequences, going back and forth, it's a validating process. You're kind of in sync with what's going on. You're agreeing with the other person about the problem and their negative affect. And if you're both doing it back and forth and saying like, that does sound like it kind of sucks, you're getting, and then also you're digging into the causes and the consequences of the problem. You're actually solving the problem too, because you're thinking about why it's happening. You're probably trying to talk about, okay, well, if I did break up with my boyfriend, what is that going to mean? And how is that going to impact my life? And you're thinking about the potential consequences. And maybe that's helping you come to a decision. And so I feel like if you model it in this way where people are really getting sucked into that region, it's validating. It's like the responsive part of it that's contributing to it. Yeah.
That's great. I guess we can talk about this later, but I'm
Yeah,
curious also whether there's like, even with this, when you're modeling in this dyadic dynamic way, would you think that there would be nonlinear effects? Like even though you found these benefits, just like not a trade-off, even with this, might there be a time when too much co-rumination would be detrimental?
That seems to make sense to me. Yeah. And then that becomes a question too of like, was 8 minutes long enough? Like, right? Sure, maybe. But like, maybe if we just let it be unconstrained and we had people that like basically just co-ruminate as long as you give them time to do it, that seems like it could potentially be bad. And then you might see more of the effects, but maybe there wasn't enough time here to do some of that stuff. We also didn't model it in that way, so I can't really answer the question directly. But it like, doing too much of it still seems bad to me. But we need to dig into all of this because we don't, and again, this is hyperfixating on social rumination in particular for both people. It's not saying anything about other emotion regulation strategies you're engaging in. So like, for people that are here where they're sucked into like the disclosure social rumination region, the disclosure is talking about their problem, socially ruminating at the other person, we don't really know what like that means in terms of the other person and what they're doing, right? Like they could be like, okay, they're doing like going on this rant again and like totally disengaging from the process. But they could also just be like providing practical responsive support that's not ruminating about it. They're actually trying to get them away from the negative affect. No idea. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just like off of that, can you grab a variable that's like where they end? Like,
Probably. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was so wonderful, Brett. This is really exciting work. So I love that you just mentioned problem solving because I was going to ask a question about problem solving because, which is another emotion regulation strategy we often talk about, right? And I'm curious if you've looked at, if you've asked participants or coded in the videos or transcripts, the extent to which they talked about or sort of discussed concrete ways to solve the problem and how you think that relates to co-rumination. Because I feel like rumination often gets a very bad rep and we think that it is inherently sort of a bad thing. But as you pointed out toward the end of your talk, right, suggesting that maybe it can actually have some potential benefits like spurring us to engage in political action or
Right.
or other activities that might benefit society. And so was just thinking about, what do we make of this relationship between co-rumination and problem solving? Are they really different or actually can they coexist? Just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the results from this study are suggesting that they coexist. So when we I have to advance on that cherry-picked example of a dyad. But when we get to here, the more that dyads got stuck in that co-rumination region, the more both people in the interaction rated the problem as being more solved. So in this case, they're coexisting, which is different from the trade-off hypothesis normally. It like, the theoretical argument made is that like you're not actually solving the problem. You're digging into the causes and the consequences. You're focusing on the negative affect. You're rehashing the problem again, but it says nothing about problem solving specifically. But here we're seeing that as you get sucked into that region, both people, even the person that it's not their problem, are saying that the problem is more solved. So yes, I think that they coexist, and like, again, we need more data to like support this. This is just one study with like 85 friend dyads, and then we found this effect that's going against the trade-off hypothesis. So I'm not going to like put a whole lot of money on it, but it seems to suggest that when we model it in this way, we're starting to see some of those benefits, which is cool. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that by and large, this area of study is ignoring the actual topic of the conversation, but I was wondering if there was any information either on co-rumination or just rumination, if that would be more readily available. If we have a difference in outcome based on the perceived severity of the problem.
Right. So, right. So we have asked people about the severity of the problem. I can't remember. I think there were, no, I don't remember off the top of my head exactly how it impacted things. But I think in general, it wasn't impacting it too much, or if it did, it made sense how it was impacting the processes, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, there are some like lower hanging fruit here of like in addition to identifying the problem, they then filled out a bunch of questions about the problem itself. And so we already have the data there that's just kind of sitting there. And so people can dig into all of that, look at the kinds of problems that people were having, how they were thinking about the problems, how severe they were, their affect associated with the problem, and then start using that to see how it's changing the trade-off hypothesis potentially.
Thank you.
Yep.
I may have missed this about the problem solving and the relationship between co-rumination. Do you have any data about like what those problems were? Like, were they like actually solvable? Like,
Oh, the solvability, I think they also rated the solvability of the problem. But yes, generally, I think they were solvable problems. So it was a convenient sample, usually of college students, and the top problems that they were identifying, just descriptively, we know that they were like academic problems or relationship problems. Again, that didn't involve the other person in the interaction. Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. I really liked how you went into, both the sort of personal problems and the more social, political problems at the end. It seemed like at a broad level, the sort of takeaways were, at the broadest level, the takeaways were kind of fairly similar. I'm curious if you could speculate or maybe go into a little more on sort of mechanisms by which you think those two might differ, even if they didn't get picked up here, like just sort of what the most important differences are that might lead to like different outcomes or different processes unfolding between like the personal problems and the social political problems.
Yeah, I think one of them actually goes back to what somebody just mentioned, which was like the solvability of the problem. So the election happens, there's results, and then it's kind of over. And so then you have to deal with the consequences of that, and there's not really a way for you on an individual level to change it. And so the extent to which you're co-ruminating about a problem that's not solvable seems potentially problematic at like an extreme level. Like I think it's very validating to turn to people that you're closest to about these systemic level problems and vent to somebody about it and to get a venting response in return. Like that seems pretty good. But then continually doing it over time when there's really nowhere to go with it, that seems like it could potentially be bad. So I think like that's one, but there's so many examples and problems that we could think about, but that seems like a pretty big one and quite different from individual level problems where like you have more control over the situation and can impact the outcome and like problem solve and figure it out and then could more dynamically change over time.
Okay, I wrote down many, but I'm gonna
Okay,
limit
yeah.
myself to one, maybe two questions.
Okay.
Okay, so the first one is curious. So you know, heterogeneity is a theme here, and thinking about what's driving some of that heterogeneity. And so one thought I had, and you know, especially coming from like the social support literature that looks a lot at, for example, individual differences or relational factors that might shape whether someone is a effective support giver
Yeah.
or not. Have you guys looked at that, or what are you thinking might be some of the factors that shape who ends up, you know, being the co-ruminators or not, or whether co-rumination is effective or not?
Right. I think one part of it, there's like a paper called like emotion ships that like gets at the idea of, you know, generally when you talk to somebody about a particular topic, how they're going to respond. And so you can turn to specific people in your life when you're like thinking about, well, what do I want to get out of this interaction? Who do I want to turn to? So what are my goals going into that conversation? Can I turn to this person to meet those goals? Or like, is this the best person to turn to in that situation? That certainly seems part of it to me. That like, you know, people in your life, maybe more on the support provider, when you're the support provider, where you know people that come to you about all their problems and vent like nonstop. And then you're like trying to respond to them about this problem over and over again. And it doesn't really seem like it's working or it's changing anything. And so that also is tapping into like that unidirectional social rumination region. And then what's going on with this responder? How are they feeling? How has this been dynamically changing over time? That all seems relevant to me. Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, I was just curious because again, it's like a whole untapped, as you said, it's
Right.
all below the
Yeah.
below the top that seems like a fruitful area. So then one of my other things I was thinking about too was these are setups where it's one person with a problem coming to someone else. And I'm curious if you guys have thought about, sometimes it might be a joint problem. It could be two friends who are both in the same class and, you know, frustrated by their professor, frustrated by a third friend of theirs, or, you know, a romantic couple dealing with some outside problem. And if you think this process would be any different if you didn't have a discloser and a responder, but both people were sort of jointly disclosing and responding.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Some of Audrey's work is looking at that. So there's like experimental manipulation. That was like the within subject study that I was talking about. So in that study, or in 2 of the 3 studies, like each person, it was a within subjects design. So you got assigned to the disclosure role, you got assigned to a responder role, and then you got assigned to a shared where you were in both disclosure and responder roles. That was starting to get at that. And generally the pattern was that like the shared condition was erring more on the side of what was happening with the disclosures. So like the disclosure part of it, it just seemed like disclosing at all, whether it was only disclosing or disclosing in more of a shared context, the outcomes were more similar. And then it was the responders that were differing from those 2 groups generally.
And do you think they'd end up in that getting sucked into the co-rumination region?
Yeah, so it seems like, and that was going back to one of the other questions of like the controllability of the outcome, but then also if you like have more of a shared problem that you both can contribute like you can both have contributions that are independent to the conversation, dig into the causes and the consequences and both have a perspective on it. That seems kind of cool. And it seems like it should generate more co-rumination in that instance too. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, that's loud. Yeah, this was a really cool talk, and it's really cool to see this kind of co-rumination idea coming out of where it's typically studied and kind of depressed middle schoolers. So thank you for pulling it from that pit. Yeah, I kind of wanted to follow up with some of these questions. Kind of, you looked at romantic partners and friends and processes of co-rumination, I think in the physiological studies. And kind of to follow up on Amy's point, I'm wondering how like the topic that they're co-ruminating on, whether it be something of shared responsibility, so like a mutual friend that they both know and can kind of talk to their grievances about that mutual friend, or vice versa, versus maybe in romantic relationships, it might be more like shared responsibilities. So co-ruminating over issues of, keeping up the house, or, chores, or maybe an office partner who, one person in the dyad knows, but the other person doesn't know. I'm just kind of wondering, yeah, and you touched on it a little bit already, but how these processes might differ in friendship dyads versus romantic dyads, and whether or not these kinds of shared responsibilities versus shared kind of knowingness of the problem is important in that.
Yeah. So just in terms of the data that we have, it does seem that like the traditional trade-off hypothesis is a little bit more muted with romantic partners than with friends, just in general across the board. That's a gross characterization of the whole thing, but that's kind of the vibe. And then in most of the studies in the literature, they're like doing this specific social support paradigm. So people are identifying problems that are not supposed to involve the other person. What does that mean exactly? How do people interpret that? I think that's open for debate. But it's supposed to be something that's not supposed to involve the other person. But we are starting to move in the direction now where like we have a conflict study that's going on right now, where we're also assessing co-rumination, and we're like expanding the concept of co-rumination into other types of conversations, which seems pretty important. And so I don't know if we have a really good answer to your question at the moment based on the state of the literature, but like we're starting to move in that direction, and we're starting to move beyond a social support context, starting to move beyond intra-individual problems, and like starting to unpack this and really dig in now that we feel like we got like a general idea of the landscape. Yeah.
I have one question. Can
Yeah,
you
sure.
Take us back to the states space grid
Yeah.
where you have the little, yeah, right there. Okay, so my question is, I'm trying to figure out how affect fits into this. So are you claiming that in co-rumination, it's not really negative affect being exchanged, or is that not really being part of this? Because I guess what I'm at on the transitions between these different spaces.
Yeah.
Now you go here, you go out.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm wondering is if co-rumination is working, and the reason you end up with its problem solving, the positive consequences, is because somewhere in this process of co-ruminating, a decision or something is made that this is getting too hot and heavy here now, and I can't deal with this anymore. So we're transitioning out of this space. So they're actually together as a dyad, regulated together. We're fine as long as this is being solved, as long as there's no real heated information, there's no conflict going on here. We're okay. It's solved. He or she's responsive to me. But for the dyads where it might be getting too, I don't know, too entwined with one another, they are making a emotion regulation decision, if that makes sense, to get out.
Yeah.
Can you look at that, or is that even a possibility? Because it just seems to me that at some point, this is one-sided, or I'm getting dysregulated or something. There needs to be a change someplace, and I'm just wondering, in your model, that's a transition. That's a change.
Yeah. So two things in response, like conceptually. So one, co-rumination is about like digging into the negative emotions. So you could just kind of be affectively kind of low, like not exhibiting it in the moment. You could be talking about how I feel like this really sucks, but I can say it in like a very monotone way and not express it very well. But you could still talk about it. And I think that would still qualify in terms of the definition of co-rumination. Like you're digging into the negative emotions about it all. It's not necessarily saying that you're experiencing the negative emotions in the moment. And then the outcome that I was showing is like after the conversation, how do you feel right now was the outcome. So they're like a little bit different, if that makes sense. And then I think that's totally one example where you have a dyad that's in this co-rumination space and they're like, yeah, this does really suck. What are the causes and the consequences? Maybe you should break up with your boyfriend, boom, and then you're out. That seems plausible to me.
What do you think is going on in your next slide where there's all those dyads that are just great, they don't even get.
Oh, yeah, engaging in one of the many other emotion regulation strategies that is not on the grid, right? Like you could have a conversation with somebody else and it's not focused on the negative emotions. Maybe you're putting like a whole positive spin on it as you're disclosing the problem, right? Like they're supposed to pick stressful and upsetting problems, but you're going into it with a lot of confidence that you feel like you can deal with it. And so the entire way that you're framing the problem changes and it never gets into
Never
like
gets-
that category at all. Yeah.
Okay.
The extent to which it was 4 items, the extent to which they stayed on topic, went over the problem over and over again. And I'm saying we, but it was individual level items. So the extent to which I stayed on topic, the extent to which I rehashed the problem over and over again, the extent to which I went into the causes and the consequences of the problem, and the extent to which I focus on the negative affect. Every 30 seconds. Yeah, right. Yep.
Okay, any last minute questions before we call it evening? And thank Dr. Peters for his talk on co-rumination and bringing us to the level of a diet. Thank you
Thanks.
very much.